Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. The curtain has now come down on the COP29 climate summit in Baku. And while a $1 trillion deal for climate financing was done at the last minute, some campaigners have called it a betrayal, as much of that will have to come from private financing or new sources which have yet to be agreed. Well, to consider where the meeting really leaves us and our planet, I'm joined now by Christine Loh, Chief Development Strategist at the Institute for Environment at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Jeremy Rifkin, author of many books, including Planet Aqua, Rethinking Our Home in the Universe. Jacopo Bencini from the Florence School of Transnational Governance, and Michael Wilkins, Executive Director and Professor of Practice at the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment at Imperial College London. Thank you all for coming on the agenda. You know what, Jeremy, let me start with you, because a lot was riding on COP29, and you know, there was a deal after days of diplomacy. So was Baku a good COP?
Well, I'm going to start with a little bit of a different fix on this. I'm a big fan of the United Nations, but I have to say the problem here is the playbook that we are using to address this crisis is what gave rise to it. It's the way we think about our approach to nature, how we educate our kids, the kind of economy we have, our forms of governance. That playbook, the age of progress, is the playbook we're using to address this crisis. It doesn't work. And here's the issue. It's very simple. We are in an extinction event. The hydrosphere is rewilding because of climate change. And what we're seeing is all over the world, winter snows that are devastating, spring floods, summer droughts, heat waves and wildfires, fall hurricanes and typhoons. They are collapsing the entire infrastructure of the industrial age in real time and taking us to the sixth extinction of life on Earth. So these ways that we're dealing with this issue at the United Nations and other global bodies, whether it be the OECD, the World Bank, or whatever, our governments, is not adequate to this event. Our scientists are telling us we're going to lose half the species of this planet to extinction, perhaps in the lifetime of today's babies. The last extinction event was 65 million years ago. So what we need to understand is a new playbook. Yeah. And I hope we get into that discussion on how we actually address this crisis in real time. New approaches to governing, economic activity, our approach to science, technology, the works. That's what needs to happen now, because this is not working. It's a failed project at this point.
Christine, let me bring you in, because the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said that he'd hoped for a more ambitious outcome on climate finance and on mitigation. Did you agree with Jeremy that we're sort of over-promising and under-delivering?
No, I think Jeremy is saying we should ditch the process, but unfortunately, it is the only international process that is available. You know, so ditching the process and starting again isn't actually so easy. But if we have to live with what we have, then I think, especially the countries of the global south, they think it's, you know, the money, the 300 billion per year for a number of years is too little. Of course, it's been some years now since we've been talking about 100 billion a year, but that never materialized, and now going up to 300 billion. And as you said earlier on, it's not just rich country giving that sum of money to the poorer countries, but it's expected to include maybe voluntary payments from the private sector. So I think a lot of people in the global south just feels that this really isn't going to work either, because even for $100 billion, it never really worked.
So you're saying that $300 billion just isn't enough. But of course, you're thinking about it, we've got that larger 2035 goal mentioned in the text of $1.3 trillion. Jacopo, what do you think here? Is it just never going to be enough?
Well, right before flying to Baku, actually, as many countries were starting talking trillions, many observers were thinking, well, it's almost impossible that in Baku we get to a decision on that kind of figure together with the other decision which was expected from COP29 on Article 6 and carbon markets, also provided that the Azerbaijani presidency didn't have perhaps the time or the adequate instruments to deal with this kind of package. In the end, when we got to the $1.3 trillion figure, of course, that was inserted also to somehow keep the Global South on the boat on the decision. Of course, we have to look carefully at what happened on the other negotiating tables. When it comes to the mitigation work program, everything was postponed to next year, together, for instance, with the working program on how to implement the global stocktake from last year, and well, with several how can we say, well, ways of forgetting what was agreed last year on the exit or transitioning away from fossil fuels. What matters the most is the compromise way. And the wording they used in the final decision when it says that the $1.3 trillion should be mobilized by all actors. And here we are, people studying treaties and global governance, and I've never seen all actors as a wording in an international treaty so far. That means that that was a way to keep the door open to many interpretations, but to have the figure on paper.
So compromise was the key. I mean, Michael, you were in Baku. What kind of feeling did you get about this and where climate financing is going?
Yes, I must admit, this COP in particular really was overshadowed by geopolitical issues more than any other COP I've attended since Copenhagen in 2009. And that backdrop in terms of the war with Russia, Ukraine, what's happening as well in the Middle East, and also the forthcoming presidency of Trump in the US, all those factors together really cast a shadow over proceedings. And not only that, but the geopolitical context within the COP was also pretty dire. We had the French and the Azerbaijani presidencies arguing with each other, the French basically withdrawing their delegation from the ministerial sessions in week 2. We had the Argentinians pulling out. It was really a complete fractious meeting. So within that context, and also the macro issues related to inflationary pressures, the amount of spending that's going into defense related to these wars, all those issues, as well as cost of living crisis, meant that the finance discussions were really quite tense and fraught. So within that, I think getting to a 300 billion per annum pledge by 2035, given that context, that's a tripling of the amount agreed at Copenhagen, is something to be measured as a small step forward.
Christine, what about the role of China, a developing country, but China has agreed voluntarily to a formula in the finance deal, allowing for its contributions to go towards that fund for climate vulnerable countries. And that's really important, isn't it?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, China is doing a lot in mitigation, although its emissions hasn't peaked yet. And on adaptation, it's also doing a lot, and it advocated adaptation cooperation at COP29. On financing, it's told us that it has already spent about $25 billion since 2016. And I guess for China, it will contribute whatever it is going to contribute to the fund, but also it will probably continue to do bilateral assistance to other global South countries.
I mean, there were hints also from the president of COP29 that China might have done more if other leading powers, other big polluters had done more. I mean, Jeremy, what do you think? Because during COP, China's special envoy for climate change said that China has become one of the world's fastest reducers of energy intensity and is leading the charge in renewable energy. I mean, how do you think what China is doing is maybe making energy structure transformation more possible around the globe?
Putting in a few $billion is just absurd at this point. But there's another whole way to do this, and that is $11 trillion have flooded out of fossil fuels over the last many years because they realize that those energies will never amortize out, all right, compared to solar and wind, which is now the cheapest energies in the world. And it's led by two huge funds of money. I mean, that's what you're talking about here, $1 billion here and $1 billion there. We're seeing to collapse the entire infrastructure of civilization with the floods, the droughts, and the heat waves and the wildfires. So pension funds, that's $40 trillion. It's the largest pool of assets in the world. It's the workers' money. And then you have insurance funds. They have a big risk here because of the collapse of the infrastructure. And they're worth $20 trillion. And I meet with these companies and every week. And what they're saying to me is, Jeremy, where are these projects that can be let out, these big infrastructure projects? All we see is pilots. We go and we talk to the mayors of these cities around the world that have signed up for the climate accord. 12,000 mayors, they'll show you their 5 electric buses, their 10 LEED buildings, and their bike paths. What we need is a complete infrastructure transformation. That's where the new opportunities are going to be, from crisis to opportunity. And so what we need to do is begin to find ways in each government that's part of the UN perspective to be able to provide green banks, green bonds, work on large infrastructure projects, get rid of the old codes, regulations, and standards of the fossil fuel-based industrial age. Let each government, as part of the UN, find a kind of a new premise, a new operational theme, if you will, in which to encourage all that money that's out there in pension funds, insurance funds, private equity to get the job done.
It's interesting what you're saying about needing those schemes, not just pilot schemes, but I think countries being able to learn from other regions of the world to see where that transformation is going and maybe learn from them. I mean,
Well, and as you know, I've worked with the European Union and China for the last 15 years, and we took part in the Build Back Better plan here. That's what we're saying. Let governments really begin to exercise some new approaches to allow these scaled projects so we can create the new jobs and industries, and at the same time get out of fossil fuels quickly.
Yeah.
And into renewables.
Can I say something?
You can go on.
I mean,
I
do agree. Yeah, I do agree with Jeremy. But one of the things that I think government needs to do is to create the markets where the billions and the trillions from the private sector can actually come in. And I find that when talking to city governments, the pilot projects is where they think they can manage. But to have the policy, the longer term policy in place that will attract a lot of capital, that's often something that I think administrators and bureaucrats are not so comfortable with. So let me just give an example, perhaps from my own city in Hong Kong. If the government were able to put in place a policy where you can say between now and 2050 that we would retrofit a large number of buildings, and they put together the encouraging policy sort of incentives, but also ways to help the private sector to invest in retrofit. Yeah. I think that's what you need. But to do that kind of policy making, I find it's quite difficult for many city governments.
But isn't that already happening in China to some extent, Jacopo? I mean, China has signed around 54 cooperation agreements with 42 developing countries on climate change cooperation, and have supported countries in the global south on low-carbon projects, on mitigation and adaptation efforts, as well as that all-important skills training, which leads to jobs. So it's looking increasingly like China's leading the way on the green energy transition, doesn't it?
Well, if you look at the contributions in terms of, financial contributions also under the new collective quantified goal at the UNFCCC, well, China in terms of historical emissions, and if you also take into account the RNI and the GNI and the population of the country, then China is already a leader in decarbonizing in that sense and in providing finance. But getting back to what Jeremy was saying, in terms of doing the homework before getting to the financial goals at the multilateral level, what is missing now at the moment is not just the proactiveness of cities, local governments, actually waiting for the instruments and the good finance to foster and to invest in these pilots that are already around. What is missing now is that reform of multilateral finance, multilateral development banking finance, that is being mentioned in the documents over the past 2 days and in the final document as well. And it took footnotes on the final decision of the COP to say that the COP has no mandate to actually push for this reform, where money is supposed to come from, money is supposed to flow from. And that all actors wording that we have in a final decision is largely based on multilateral development banks. And to be honest, having China, India on board with more investment, more capital mobilization together with the European Union, and let's see what happens in the United States, whether a new "we are still in" movement will emerge at some point, something that we don't know yet. But even having all these actors on board, what is needed is a global reform of multilateral finance, because otherwise these trillions will still get to have access problems in many markets in the world, especially where most needed to develop these projects on the ground.
One thing that's often misunderstood is what reform of multilateral agencies actually means. And, you know, from the point of view of looking at the appetite for risk that these institutions have, so the World Banks and the ADBs of this world, all these multilateral institutions are on the whole, pretty risk-averse institutions. They all, or most of them, have AAA ratings, and they are, you know, very keenly holding on to those ratings, the highest possible, and moving into climate finance projects, adaptation projects, and mitigation projects are perceived as quite a risky move for a lot of these entities. So the question is, how do we de-risk a lot of these investments? How do we de-risk a lot of these projects? And there was a big move at COP to actually bring in new mechanisms, new forms of enabling mechanisms to catalyze more finance. So that $1.3 trillion per annum figure won't happen just because the World Bank or other multilaterals step up in their contributions. It's only going to happen if you bring in the full force of the capital markets to bear on trying to tackle this crisis. You've got to bear in mind that the capital markets have somewhere in the region of $93 trillion of assets outstanding in terms of bonds and other fixed income securities. So you just need a fraction of that to actually make a difference in the climate finance world. So if you get enabling mechanism, and this is where things like insurance come in, if you can get more blended finance mechanisms where the initial losses of these projects are taken by either insurance companies or guarantees at the risk capital level, that should crowd in a lot more private finance at the less risky elements of the capital stack. And that kind of structure and that kind of innovation is what's required to try and tackle this issue.
Okay. Jeremy, you've talked about the COP process being problematic, but I wonder to what extent fears about Trump's new administration in the United States damaging the global approach to climate overshadowed the meeting in Baku.
Well, I think what's not understood about the United States, even by some of the powers that be, is this. 92% of the infrastructure of this country is controlled by the states, not the federal government. All right, that's the first thing to understand. All right, and what's happening in the states is very interesting. It's generally the red states that are putting in all the solar and wind utility scale. Red states. They're the ones in these agricultural regions that are putting in utility scale solar and wind, and now moving to green hydrogen. That's not going to fall back because the market's there, the price is there, and so that's a future. But there's another element that we're totally missing here, and that is that there are two aspects to what we have to do. One is a green deal, but the other is a blue deal. And what's happening in Europe right now is the discussion is floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, hurricanes, typhoons, and the collapse of the infrastructure. So what we're going to have to do is continue to mitigate global warming really quickly, because For every 1 degree Celsius that temperature goes up, we got more floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, and collapse of the infrastructure. On the other side, we've got to move a blue deal, which is industry is saying we don't have water at the right time for thermoelectric power plants. The agriculture is saying we can't fertilize our crops. The urban infrastructure now is collapsing from floods. So building resilience is a whole new way to go side by side with a green deal and a blue deal and create the new jobs and opportunities. And what everyone agrees on is that a blue deal makes sense, regardless of your politics, because no one wants to be caught up in a collapsed infrastructure in which they can't actually live. So I think that's the next step. We're seeing it in Europe. We're seeing it start in China. I think it won't be long before it'll move to the U.S. And I would encourage the United Nations to begin to take a look at a green deal along with a blue deal. That's where we're going to head. That's the way we survive and hopefully thrive.
It does seem, though, that everyone is advocating for more collaboration, more cooperation. So, Christine, in terms of strengthening international partnerships and advocating for climate justice, was any real progress made?
Well, I think some of the things that China put on the table is useful to look at. It's advocating a global risk assessment, climate risk assessment network. It is prepared to share assessment data and building this network. It's pushing also towards what the UN wants to do, which is an early warning system, because many parts of the world, including in the tropics and subtropics, we're facing extreme and severe weather much more often than before. But the global south doesn't necessarily have the means to deal with it. So having early warning systems that work well is really, really important to save life and to protect property. So I think some of those things may sound very boring, but they're also a very important part of climate governance.
And Jacopo, I'm hoping you don't think this one's boring, but countries representing nearly 50% of global methane emissions from organic waste have endorsed the COP29 declaration on reducing methane from organic waste. It is promising. It's not the breakthrough, though, that everyone was hoping for, is it?
It is promising indeed, as it was promising in 2021 in Glasgow to see the United States and the European Union pledging to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. When we look at these agreements, which are collateral to the main processes, if you want to do the main diplomatic process under the UNFCCC, of course, they are promising if promises are kept, if the same government, if the same commitment that you see in the room at the moment when the agreement is signed, then stays for the years necessary to get these promises done. And then again, you need the money to actually have programs and plans developed on the ground. And I really agree with what Mike Wilkins was saying a few minutes ago in terms of de-risking these investments and this capital to be mobilized around. And I think that something that came out really interestingly from COP29, even though not much covered maybe in the media, is a part of the methodologies under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, where for the first time the United Nations actually pointed a finger in saying who should be liable, where is the responsibility in case of failed projects, in case of reversals, for instance, when it comes to removals. And in that sense, now you have a mechanism, you have a distinction between avoidable and unavoidable failure of projects, and you also have a grievance mechanism.
You're talking about the Paris Agreement, and it's making me think about last year's communique and something that was made no reference to this time round, accelerating towards that goal of phasing out fossil fuels. European and US negotiators have really, really pushed for that. Michael, what do you make of it being not in this text?
Yeah, well, I think that reflects really a strong lobby by the world's fossil fuel producers to eliminate that explicit reference to a transition away from fossil fuels in the COP29 final text. I mean, there are some rough references to it, some oblique references, but not exactly, hitting the nail on the head. And I think the reason for that is because the presidency at COP29 wasn't in the same position as the UAE was at COP28, where it basically had influence over its strong Gulf neighbors such as Saudi Arabia to actually agree to that text. I mean, there was a lot of talk about Saudi Arabia actually trying to take control and eliminating any fossil fuel reference whatsoever. So I think, again, I point you back to my comments about geopolitical issues overshadowing this COP. And I think that's why we've got to this rather disappointing elimination of any further strengthening of the language on fossil fuel transition, let alone phase out.
Jeremy, you say that we need a new playbook when it comes to climate. Who's going to write that playbook?
I think the playbook's emerging now, especially in Europe and in China. And that is that we're beginning to realize that we've gotten it wrong for a long time. It didn't just start with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Age and the nation states. We have misunderstood the planet we live on. And we've always lived on a land planet, when in fact we live on a water planet. And what's becoming clear is that the hydrosphere of this planet is the animator of all of life. Everything we do is merely a response to where the hydrosphere is going. Without a hydrosphere, there's no litmosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere. And that hydrosphere really is rewilding the floods, the droughts, the heat waves. It's determining the future. It's determining where the new governance is going to be. It's determining where the new ecosystems are going to be. That's the reality. So what we need to do now is we need to have a frame of reference on how we began to, and all of our institutions, move more to a bioregional governance. We don't give up nation states, but what we've learned is climate events don't honor political boundaries. They affect ecosystems, floods, droughts, heat waves, and they require moving across political boundaries and sharing common ecosystems. So one of the things we could do, which would be a leap forward, we have two great bioregional governances in the U.S. They're a good example. The Great Lakes, the 5 Great Lakes, which is 20% of all the remaining water on the planet, and the provinces of Canada. And then we have another one in the Northwest, between the Northwest states and the Canadian provinces. They share a common ecosystem. They understand the hydrosphere implications. They don't want to see another Oral Sea. So what we need to do, Europe only has one bioregion between France and Spain in the Pyrenees. China, to its great credit, has 8 ecoregions that have now been established. So we keep our national sovereignty at the UN, but we also have to realize we go to a more bioregional governance as well, and we extend our sovereignty in order to be able to prepare, rescue, restore, and rehabilitate the environments we're in, the ecosystem we're in. This is where you're going to get a lot of support. You're going to get a lot of support, not just from industry, but the public, who's scared to death about the world they're living in, with a hydrosphere that's giving them floods, droughts, heat waves, wildfires, and hurricanes. So there's a huge opportunity from this crisis. But we have to think new ways on how the UN can be helpful in giving us a sense that our nation states have to move to bioregional governance, understand the hydrosphere is the framing reference, putting in a blue deal, allowing people to create new jobs and businesses around the opportunities that exist, and understanding we live on a water planet.
Jeremy Rifkin, Christine Lowe, Jacopo Bencini, and Michael Wilkins, thank you all so very much. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are 2 ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.